Hello and welcome. Today's webinar, Navigating Evolving Market Forces, is sponsored by the Foundation of the Wall and Ceiling Industry. I am Anne-Marie Salvatelli, Executive Director at the Foundation. The goal of the Foundation is to increase the Foundation and AWCI sphere of influence to become an industry resource for AWCI members. The Foundation and AWCI partnered with FMI to conduct a comprehensive industry business trends survey with its members. The survey and today's presentation is funded by the Foundation. Our webinar, Navigating Evolving Market Forces, is presented by Paul Trombitas with FMI. Paul is a partner with FMI's strategy practice and leads the building products sector team. He brings FMI's unique understanding and depth of experience in the construction industry to stakeholders in the building products space. Paul is responsible for FMI's building products market overview. In his more than 10 years with FMI, Paul has developed expertise across various sectors in the built environment. And now I would like to turn it over to Paul, where he will present the key findings from the survey. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to share the results of the second annual study. A lot to dig into today. And just as Anne-Marie mentioned, a little background on FMI. We're a management consulting and investment banking firm. And what's unique about us is that for the 70 years we have been in business, the only industry that we focus on is construction. So our clients are general contractors, trade contractors, architects, engineers, building product manufacturers, distributors. So our bankers and consultants are involved in these businesses every day and really gives us unique perspective and also just helps drive a lot of the insights that we were able to uncover through this second annual study. So very excited to share that today. And so through the presentation, really three main areas I hope that folks can take away from this. First, starting with just the overall market outlook. What are the segments that we're going to see demand in? How are the main sectors from residential, non-residential, non-building performing over the forecast? And then what are those major trends and drivers underpinning demand? What are some of the unique dynamics occurring in the market currently, and then how is that anticipated to evolve? And then most importantly, the results of the AWCI membership trends study. So let's dig in. So I like to start, and I think it's most important to start for where are we in our current situation? And so what you can see here is our Q4 2025 market outlook. And so when we look at the overall market, so combine non-res, res, and non-building, annual growth rate from 25 to 29 of 3.7%. And now of those three sectors, residential anticipated to be the lowest at 3.2%, non-residential at 3.7%, and non-building at 4.6%. Now, it is important to note that residential of the three is the largest as a percentage of total spending, so right around 42%. And on average, that's $960 billion a year from 25 to 29. Following that is non-residential, which is $890 billion, and represents about 39%. And then third is non-building. So that's infrastructure, power, conservation development, and so a smaller percentage, right around 19%, and about 430 billion through the forecast period. Now, I will say that in residential, what we're seeing is an uptick in growth from really starting latter half of 26 into 27, and we feel very confident moving forward. We'll see continued uptick in momentum there. We did see a lull, if you will, in multifamily, given the buildup over the last several years. And then on the non-res side, there's a number of segments that we'll dive into here in a bit, but that are underpinning demand. I'm sure, as most people know, data centers is the hot spot right now, and that continues to see substantial growth. And then the other key piece is, as we look at this forecast, it's important to think about it as it gives a general direction, the overall trends now where folks are operating in their geographies or the segments that they're participating in, gives a good barometer of how your market compares to the overall market. And so one thing to consider is if we see continued growth and an uptick as we anticipate really into 26 and 27, how will folks react? Are they going to be more selective, more considerate and strategic about the projects they pursue, or we see a change or a slowing of growth really dictating and seeing more firms get more aggressive about pursuing projects. So it's a great way just to give a sense of how others may act, as well as how your markets compare to the overall construction space. Another key piece that we like to factor in is the sentiment indices. And so we have a number that we look at, several of which are conducted in-house at FMI. So we have our non-residential construction index, which is all non-residential contractors. We have our heavy civil index, and then an index we do with CERT, which is the largest engineering and contracting firms, but we also like to look at NHB and AIA. And so when I think about the sentiment indices for ours, it's really a quarter or two down the road, whereas AIA is a little bit further down the road as they have, they have the ear of the owner and really understand what's coming down the pipeline. So it's good to give a comparison and contrast those. And most importantly, this will be our second index that we have for AWCI. And in fact, compared to 2024, we saw an uptick of sentiment and favorability of the market. Now, these are diffusion indices, so that means anything above a 50 is growth, 50 is stable, and below 50 is decline. Now, we've seen some shifts over the last several months, in particular AIA. You can see that the lighter blue line slightly below that 50. So just given the economic dynamics, uncertainty, that certainly we see projects being pushed to the right, if you will. The NHB, the Home Builder Index, they tend to be more volatile, but they have seen a continued uptick towards the positive, still below 50, but trending up. And CERT, actually this quarter is quite a bit higher than what we saw in Q3, which is a positive sign. And going back again, positive sign for the AWCI membership index. So again, this is another way, it's the way people feel about the market, it's their perspective. And so again, going back to the idea around how people will react if these continue to see increases, or if we continue to see a decline, will they get more aggressive? Are they going to get more strategic? So just a great way to think about the market in a different aspect. So thinking about the overall market, and I like to think of it as looking at the surface of the water, and what's going on beneath is really what's the interesting part. And so over the next several years through 29, what is going to happen? And so an interesting point is you can look at a segment and looks can be deceiving. So for instance, office, 7.9% annual growth rate over the forecast period, which for most folks would wonder if we know what we're talking about, jokingly, of course. But what's important to note here is that data centers is included in office, and it's anticipated that data centers is going to represent as much as 50 or even more % of spending of the office segment, such that the U.S. Census Bureau has decided it needs to be its own segment. So that is creating a lot of the growth there in the office space. Likewise with commercial, it's warehouse included in that. So those kind of unique dynamics and subsectors within each of those are important to note. Now, I will say that two of which that I see and we're hearing more about is education, particularly around just the number of schools that were built between 1999 before 2000, I think 58%. So a substantial amount. So we're seeing a lot more investment in upgrades, renovations, retrofits, and then on the healthcare side, interesting switch here more towards larger healthcare expansions. So in fact, we're tracking 15 projects of over $500 million in moving forward, and 8 of them are over $1 billion. So that's a notable surge in these large expansion projects. And then it really kind of goes back to what's underpinning demand. And so is it economic driven? Is it other factors, societal, demographic, technological? And so things like manufacturing, that although it's a 2.3% annual growth rate, is at an unprecedented level compared to 5 years ago, where it has from 21 to 22, 22 to 23, and 23 to 24, essentially tripled in size. So it is a new high that is going to maintain. So although it is a lower growth rate, we still see continued spending in high tech, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, food and bev. So it's going to maintain that strong growth, not growth, but strong volume of spending in that marketplace. And then certainly on the non-building side, with injection of funding from the federal government, certainly anticipated to maintain continued less volatility in that space. And I did want to call out data centers, given that it is the top market in the U.S. And in fact, if you look at our forecast for data centers through 2029, 17% annual growth rate, which is pretty phenomenal, and anticipated to reach over about 77 billion in 2029. Interesting piece here that we're starting to see changes is because of power consumption, water demands. When you look at the historical locations for data centers, so Virginia in particular, an interesting report that was put out, it showcased the percentage of electrical consumption that data centers represent of various geographies. In Virginia has been the hotspot for data centers, and it represents nearly 30% of electrical consumption. So given that, and the challenges with the grid and outages, we're starting to see data centers being located now in more tertiary markets. So Louisiana, Arkansas, so starting to see areas that have traditionally not been data center locations, and a large driver of that is because of access to power, access to water. And if you look at this chart and you see those owners on the list there, 7 of those have programs or projects that are between $1 and $5 billion, and 6 have projects that are in excess of $5 billion. So a lot of spending going on just in a small concentrated group. That's not to mention all the others. And that's driven a surge of AI, cloud computing. And so just a major trend in the market, important to note. Another piece is we completed a study earlier this year on volumetric modular construction. And so from 2023 to 2027, 30% total growth, reaching right around $25 million in pure volumetric modular construction. And we're starting to see more and more use of not just the volumetric, but panelization, kitting, prefab, and in several cases, owners dictating a certain percentage of projects need to be prefab offsite. And a lot of that is driven by aggressive schedules. It's the challenges with the labor force, and in thinking about ways to gain efficiency and consistency on projects. So we continue to see that as a trend in the market. It's not a new concept, but certainly with the dynamics going on, continues to gain momentum. I wanted to call this out because I think it's an interesting component of the industry when you think about just the overall distribution dynamics. Historically, you have your one-step or two-step. Well, it's become a lot more complex in that we have the one-step, the two-step, you have big box, you have direct, and the new emphasis on e-commerce. We're seeing that a lot more on the residential side. And it goes from a spectrum of you have an online configurator tool to quoting tools to a full online storefront. And this is really aimed at simplifying the process, and several distributors as well as manufacturers have invested significant resources in developing tools for their online presence. And in fact, you look at Home Depot from 2 years ago at about 5% of their revenue to last year right below 15%. So a substantial increase there. And we continue to see that as a trend in the marketplace. I wanted to also call out, when we look at the M&A activity, given the uncertainty and tariff dynamics and difficulties in really planning for what's going to come around in the next 3 or 6 months, what we have seen is deal count in M&A activity for building products at a low compared to the last several years, going back to 2019. Now there on the top, you can see the yellow line being that the average deal count, and so we're below that. And on the bottom chart, it shows the various components or products that are, the blue dot is historical average, and then the blue bar is where we are today. So outside of LBM, we're below historical norms, which goes again to the dynamic around the wait and see and uncertainty. There are certainly going to be, as the market shifts, we see growth into 26 and 27, more deal activity, and it's really that wait and see mentality at the moment. But on the opposite side of that, although deal flow has been down, what we have seen in the last 18 months is the number of transformative deals at a pretty substantial high. So in total, roughly $60 billion of deal. You think about Home Depot and GMS, Lowe's, FBM, QXO Beacon, James Hardie, AZEK, Home Depot, SRS, Owens Corning, Masonite. So really large strategic deals that these firms have the benefit of taking a longer term perspective, rather than when you look at the orange bar on the chart on the left, where PE platforms over that time frame from 19 to 25 has essentially been cut in half. And that's largely driven by the timeline that they're looking at exits, so that 3 to 5 year. And so when is the right time to get into the market? And given the current wait and see and uncertainty, it's not necessarily a recipe for successful entry at this point, whereas the strategic buyers have that luxury of the long-term 10, 15 years and can weather the storm of whether it's a challenging 3 years or 5 years. And so that's really an interesting dynamic that we're starting to see. So despite the lower deal flow, we've seen a number of large transformational deals. So now on to the important component. So this is the second annual AWCI member industry trend survey. we had a total of 190 participants, and that was across manufacturers, contractors, distributors, and the 4 census regions. So the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, and the West Coast. And to dive in, and an important piece here I want to highlight is comparing this year's survey results to last year's. So if we look at the overall market and the sentiment, if you will, on how is the market performing, from the economy to the local economics where firms are participating, the construction market, the wall and ceiling market, still a higher percentage of worsening from 24. However, that percentage has decreased from last year's results and improving. So at the top there, we've seen quite a bit of an uptick there, particularly around the overall economy. So although we have seen uptick, there's still the broader overall uncertainty in the market, and that's carrying over to the construction space as well as the wall and ceiling space. And so the sentiment has increased in a positive light, but there's still challenges or uncertainty related to what's next in the market. Good thing is it is seeing positive growth and momentum from respondents. And so how did each of the respondent types think about the market in terms of from the economy to the construction space, and how did it vary? And the interesting dynamic here is when you look at the contractor and manufacturer, in last year's survey, they were switched. The manufacturers were more positive and the contractors were on the less optimistic side. All three, though, maintaining similar results of last year, below that remaining the same on average. Now, when we look at it by a regional basis, the respondents in the South certainly quite a bit more optimistic compared to other regions, the Northeast as well, where we had, aligns well with where we're seeing the trend in net migration, corporate relocations, just overall growth, versus the weakest being in the Midwest and then the West. So no notable improvements or as well as declines, but really just staying the same. But we did see improvements in the South and the Northeast. And then looking at where folks perceived opportunities in segments moving forward. Now, it's interesting here. So the blue bar is this year's survey, 25, and then the gray bar is from 24. And interesting, the segments didn't necessarily change order. There's a few that moved up 1 or 2, but data centers, healthcare, K through 12 remained strong and actually either equaled last year or were more favorable. The only one that we saw a decline in favorability was in the single family space, which, given the rates, the affordability, uncertainty, really ties back to the overall economy. And but we still see strong perceptions and anticipated growth in the similar segments that we saw last year. And so how does that break out across member types? And so across members, very much alignment on healthcare, data centers, and in fact, contractors and manufacturers had the same data center, healthcare, K through 12, whereas suppliers had manufacturing as a more favorable outlook for 2026. Now, on the opposite side of that, when we look at this, the segments where there was less favorable outlook, single family for contractors, overall office was consistent, religious was consistent, contractors in particular had single family, manufacturers had amusement and rec, along with suppliers. So segments that enlarge single family, given from a contractor side, is a large market, but outside of that, religious, amusement and rec, smaller markets. And then on the office side, that's more the pure office, not data center, which when we split out the two makes a lot of sense. But an interesting point here is that the FCC released a report last year, and it looked at the last 15 years of corporate relocation, so number of companies relocating out of their current states. And last year was the highest percent of corporations relocating out of their states, and it was the secondary markets in really the Southeast, so Raleigh, Charlotte, Nashville, Tampa, Orlando, several in Texas. So what we would anticipate over the next several years is these secondary markets, as we see high net migrations, and what's going to create additional infrastructure needs, healthcare, education, start to tick up on the chart of becoming more of those primary markets in the U.S. And so despite overall sentiment, there's certainly geographic pockets of opportunity and positive momentum. So I think this is starting to get into more of the detail, which is exciting. And so there's two sections here. On the left side is the contractors, and so asking what their backlog, their current backlog was compared to what they anticipated. And so when we look at that, 41% said lower, which is actually improved since the last survey. And we have over 50% saying it's their expected demand or higher. Now, when we shift to the manufacturer and suppliers, actually manufacturers in particular had 58% total lower in terms of somewhat lower or lower in terms of their demand for wall and ceiling products, which was quite a bit higher than what we saw last year. So 26 points compared to last year. So ties back into the uncertainty, and certainly Q1, Q2 with the tariff dynamics. I know that was a very challenging time, and really trying to figure out what's going to happen. And so certainly lending itself to the challenges and what demand was going to look like and forecasting that accurately. And then on the supplier side, a little bit higher in terms of higher, lower demand, if that resonates, what they had forecasted. So 63% said that it was lower or significantly lower than they had anticipated, but we still have over 30% saying it expected it was higher or significantly higher. Now, when we start to get into looking at manufacturers and suppliers and how they perceive demand over the last 18 months versus how they perceive demand to change moving forward over the next 18 months. So if we're starting with the manufacturers, a fairly even split between moderate improvement over the last 18 months, stayed the same, or moderately worse, versus moving forward, 53% certainly have more optimism over the next 18 months, and a much lower percent being only 5% in that moderately worse. So a lot more optimism, a lot more, I could even say, excitement about what demand looks like over the next 18 months. And then on the supplier side, which was interesting here, on over the last 18 months, it was a clear, either they were significantly improved, it was the same, or worse. There wasn't any moderate improvement, and so that was a unique dynamic. But when we look at how they anticipate over the next 18 months, substantially higher on favorability and product demand. So 62% of folks indicated that they're optimistic about the next 18 months, and a much lower percentage in terms of it worsening. And that was more favorable actually than the previous the study from last year. Now, here's another really interesting one, is looking at manufacturers and suppliers and their preparedness from a capacity standpoint, to address demand in the next 18 months. So you can see manufacturers here at 44% and suppliers at 77%. And so it was a big uptick from last year for suppliers, and it went 21% uptick of suppliers saying that they're extremely prepared, and slightly lower than 10% of manufacturers said they're extremely prepared. So overall, more optimism and preparedness to address that capacity that, as we talked about on the previous slide, that they anticipate to see being more favorable. Now, opposite of that is on the competitive landscape. The manufacturers remain largely unchanged. 19% see significant change in the competitive landscape, whereas last year, I believe it was either 15 or 17%, so not a big change. Where we did see the biggest change is in suppliers. So 16% increase from last year of suppliers saying that the competitive landscape is going to see a significant change, which aligns very much with what we're seeing in the consolidation aspect of the market, from the GMSs, from the QXOs and the Beacons and SRSs and FBMs of the world. So those large transformative deals. And also, as we've seen, private equity activity not as aggressive, but still making acquisitions in the distribution space. So that certainly is an area where we're seeing more of that consolidation, as well as outside investment continuing. It's very clearly shown here in the results from the suppliers, and that the competitive landscape continuing to evolve. Now, on the contractor side, when we looked at their labor productivity, now looking back at the last 18 months, right around 40% said it declined, and a lower 13% said it had improved, versus over the next 18 months, essentially doubling the improvement in labor productivity. And a lot of that goes back to the prefab, panelization, modular construction. And then with that, the roles in which are most pressing, this has not changed at all since the previous study in terms of, and the thing about labor challenges in the market is that when we look back to articles in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, we see headlines of construction labor challenges. So it's less of a problem, if you will, because a problem is something that's solved. It's more in the way we're thinking about it is it's a characteristic of the industry. It's going to be a challenge. It has been over the last 5 decades. So firms starting to think differently about it. It is a characteristic. So now when we have that mindset, what do we do differently to better address that? What are the innovations or productivity improvement areas that we can focus on, because we know this is going to be a characteristic that we're going to have to deal with. And so just aligning with previous study and just overall industry sentiment. So we asked the participants across the contractors, the manufacturers, and suppliers, what were the greatest challenges that their firms were facing? So they had a list of 17 that they could choose from and rate on a scale of 1 to 3, 3 being a major concern, 1 being not a concern. And so across all member types, there were 2 that were aligned across all 4. That was the economic outlook, which, as I've talked at this point pretty lengthy about, is economic outlook, and then also cost escalation. which has been a topic of conversation due to tariff and just overall affordability components. And so those two are across contractors, manufacturers, and suppliers. And then additionally, a group of two, so two stakeholder types or member types. So talent availability, people development, industry consolidation being challenges for them. And then as far as unique challenges, so for contractors, it was the operational efficiency, productivity. For manufacturers, which makes a ton of sense here, is the tariffs. And then on the supplier side, it was the political environment. So interesting to see alignment across economic outlook, cost escalation, industry consolidation, people, talent, and then certainly some unique dynamics within each of those as well. And here's when we get into asking folks, in particular, looking at contractors and their challenges that they're facing for their businesses, and how aware are their manufacturer partners and supplier partners of the challenges that they face, or what is their perceived awareness. And this is interesting to me because you have your contractors. So the first set of bar charts is contractors rating manufacturers' awareness of their challenges. So 26% of contractors believe that manufacturers have either moderate or essentially a strong awareness of their challenges. So about a quarter, versus manufacturers perceive, almost 70% of them believe they have a strong awareness of their contractor challenge, their contractor partner challenges, which you can see there's a delta of around 40%. There's some rounding there, but roughly 40%. Now we look at the contractor and supplier. Contractors believe that suppliers, 34% of contractors perceive that suppliers have a strong understanding of their challenges, but the suppliers are certainly more favorable about how well they perceive their understanding of challenges, given that they have 85% of them indicated they have a strong understanding. Now, interesting, so when we look at the contractor manufacturer piece, so of the 7 challenges that top 7 challenges contractors rated, manufacturers underrated those, so identifying those as not challenges, so over half. And one of the areas that manufacturers overestimated was contractors' challenges with adoption of technology. Now on the supplier side, it was interesting. Out of 6 out of the 7 top challenges that contractors noted, suppliers overrated how important they were. So it's kind of a opposite, right? The manufacturers underrated a number of factors, suppliers overrated it. And so I think going back to, still remains a gap in how clear understanding of challenges and the differences across contractors and alignment of those business challenges between the stakeholder group. So certainly an area of opportunity and an interesting dynamic just to dive into. And then looking at manufacturers and suppliers, this one is really, I've said interesting, but it's all interesting because it's such great insight into how folks are perceiving other stakeholders that they operate within in the wall and ceiling industry. And so for manufacturers, they believe they have a strong awareness of their supplier partners' challenges. So 69% believe they have a strong understanding of the challenges that their supplier partners are dealing with. That's a 14% increase from, 14% 14% increase from the previous survey in 2024. Whereas if you look at the suppliers, none of them noted that their manufacturer partners were perfectly aware. It's only mostly aware, and it was 31%. So that's a delta of 38%. And so the alignment between the two is an interesting aspect. And when you're looking at what were those factors, it really started to boil down to their relationship, their awareness of talent, their investment in technology, pain points related to inventory, delivery, logistics, and so a number of things to dive into and really close that gap of awareness. So looking at what's impacting the supply of products, and this is specific to suppliers and manufacturers. Now, what we have here is the higher up on the vertical is the higher impact for manufacturers, and the further to the right on in that darker blue is the higher impact to suppliers. So the changing requirements of contractors and the availability of experienced certified drivers remained very similar from the previous study, as they were the highest impact factors, and obviously changing requirements of contractors more so for manufacturers, and the availability of drivers for suppliers. Now, what we did see is a shift up for compressed and accelerated schedules, more so for the manufacturers, less of an impact on the supplier side, but clearly something that manufacturers are seeing and experiencing and having an impact on their supply of products. Now, where we did see a shift down or of less impact was for suppliers in particular, the increase in direct to contractor sales, and also transportation requirements and regulations. That shifted quite a bit from 24. And then prefab remained right around the same spot. So interesting how that has shifted just in the last year. And then gaining a deeper understanding of what are strategic priorities for each of these stakeholder types. So when we look at contractors, it shifted more towards how do we get stronger in the markets we currently are in. So increasing market share in whether we're in healthcare in Des Moines, how do we grow our healthcare revenue? And then if we're working with the local developer or public school district, how do we capture more market share or wallet share of that owner in particular? So really honing in on less so of expanding outside to new segments or new geographies, but really penetrating our current and existing markets to a greater extent. And on the manufacturing side, it's really the expansion of product offerings, thinking about new innovations. How do we get new products that aren't just a me too, but are truly addressing pain points in the industry and are going to alleviate challenges for contractors and installers in the market, and what services are going to be value additive for these firms. And then on the supplier side, similar, and it was interesting as we did a more deep dive into supplier, there's really three main areas we see a focus. It's expanding product breadth, it's geographic expansion, it's value added services. So whether that's on-site repair or job site delivery or e-commerce, that has been a standalone component in focusing on the really technological side of it. And so rounding it out here, when we look at how do we anticipate technologies to impact these businesses, we can look at contractors, manufacturers, and suppliers. And across the board, AI has been a major component. along with that, so when we look at contractors, AI has been top. And the other piece with that is BIM modeling becoming a project requirement, having those internal capabilities and knowledge to effectively utilize those programs, and how do they improve their project delivery. But we also have the connected tools, the virtual reality augmented, so you can see what the facility or project is going to look like and where products are going to go, which has been a unique advancement in technology. And then on the manufacturing side, certainly automation, AI being top was interesting, as R&D was top last year, and it has fallen to behind logistics tracking. So R&D and capacity tracking are numbers 6 and 7, but really goes to, for manufacturing, it's how do we track our inventory more effectively, our production planning, and our logistics. And then on the supplier side, again, AI and more of that tracking component of it. And so when we look at the findings from this year's study, there's certainly interesting dynamics in the market. We have technological advancements, there's the uncertainty, there's the wait and see, there's the e-commerce. So it's important to consider, what are these trends that are truly impacting the market? How are they shaping the areas in which we operate, and how do we adjust for those changes? And what's most important for our organization to focus on now and make the correct changes to spend time, effort, resources to be ready and structured as the market turns over the next several years to take advantage of that. And I will end with that, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in, listening, hearing about our perspective as well as this year's great data, and looking forward to the release of the full report. So thank you all.
And thank you, Paul. On behalf of the Foundation and AWCI, we would like to thank you for discussing the key findings of the AWCI and FMI industry report. And to all of our friends listening, the findings from this study are intended to provide market insights that enable member companies and AWCI to think strategically about the market and their businesses. And you can view the full report on our website. Thank you all.